So, when it comes to climate models, what's the deal? Are they some kind of crystal ball accurately predicting our future, or are they just wrong? It's a super confusing topic and people argue about it all the time. Let's try to clear this up. If you've been on the internet for more than 5 minutes, you've probably seen both of these takes. On one side, you've got, the models are a complete failure, they're always wrong. And on the other side, you have, trust the science, the models are flawless. Well, I've got news for you. Both of those statements are just plain wrong.
So, to figure out what's actually going on, we have to start at the beginning. We need to understand what a climate model really is, and, just as importantly, what it isn't.
Okay, first things first, let's just bust a huge myth right out of the gate. A climate model is not some wild guess about the future. The best way to think about it is like a giant, incredibly powerful physics calculator. It's a massive software program that's built to solve the fundamental laws of physics that, govern how our planet actually works.
At its core, it's really just running the numbers on a few key things. You've got the energy coming in from the sun versus the energy that radiates back out to space. You've got the way heat moves all around the globe through our oceans and atmosphere, and of course, the big one, how greenhouse gases trap some of that outgoing heat. This isn't controversial stuff, it's basic textbook physics. So how does it actually do all that? Well, the model breaks up the entire planet, the air, the oceans, everything into this huge 3D grid. Each little box might be 100 kilometers across. Now, this makes them amazing for seeing the big picture, for seeing global trends. But it also means they have limitations. A climate model is never going to tell you if a thunderstorm is going to hit your specific city on a specific day. They just don't work on that scale.
And this brings up the most important question of all. If these models are making predictions for 2050 or 2080, how in the world do we know if they're any good today? It's not like we can just sit around for 50 years and see what happens.
Well, there's a really clever way to test them. It's a process called hindcasting. Basically, scientists will start the model way in the past, let's say in the year 1850. They feed it all the data we know from that time, the CO2 levels, the big volcanic eruptions, solar activity, all of it. Then they press go and see if the model can successfully recreate the climate that we've already observed from 1850 to today. If it can nail the past, then we can have some real confidence that its physics are solid for projecting the future. The key takeaway here is that these models are absolutely testable.
Okay, so they're testable. Let's look at the evidence. How have these models actually stacked up against reality over the last, say, 40 years?
And we can go way back here. In 1979, the Charney report, using very early models, estimated how much warming we'd get if CO2 levels doubled. Now fast forward over 40 years to the 2021 IPCC report. With all of our supercomputers and incredible new science, did they throw that old number out? Nope. They just narrowed the range. The core science has become more confident over time, not been proven wrong.
Now let's look at a really famous one. Back in 1988, scientist James Hansen presented 3 possible scenarios to Congress. Scenario A was a high emissions future, C was a low one, and Scenario B was kind of a business-as-usual path. So what actually happened? Well, the real world's observed warming, about 0.2 degrees Celsius per decade, lines up shockingly well with his Scenario B. It wasn't perfect, not by a long shot, but the fundamental physics in his model were clearly pointing in the right direction.
So if we step back and try to make a fair assessment of the whole track record, it would be something like this. Most models have actually done a pretty good job of capturing the overall direction and scale of the warming. But, and this is a really important but, the actual warming we've seen has tended to be on the cooler end of what the group of models predicted. It's not outside the range of possibilities they gave, but it's usually in the bottom half.
Now, saying they're pretty good is not the same as saying they're perfect. So let's talk about the blind spots, the things models still struggle with, and let's tackle what is probably the single biggest point of confusion for the public.
So where are the models still a little shaky? Well, there are a few big areas. One is aerosols. That's basically industrial pollution, which counterintuitively can have a cooling effect that's really tough to nail down. Another is natural cycles like El Niño. Models can simulate these cycles, but they can't predict when a strong one will hit years in advance. And finally, they're just much better at the global average temperature than they are at telling you exactly what will happen in your specific region. And you may have heard that some of the very latest, most advanced models started running too hot, predicting way more warming than earlier ones. And that's true. But what happened next is key. The scientific community didn't just blindly accept it. They compared those models to real-world data, to our actual observations, and they concluded that those specific models were probably a bit too sensitive. See, that's not science failing, That's science working exactly as it's supposed to. It's self-correcting. This all leads us to the most critical distinction you need to understand. There are two totally different kinds of uncertainty here. First, there's model uncertainty. That's about the physics inside the model. You know, how sensitive is the climate system really? But then there's scenario uncertainty. That has nothing to do with physics. That's about the story we humans feed into the model. What choices are we going to make? How much CO2 are we actually going to emit? These are not the same thing at all.
And this analogy just nails it. Blaming a climate model for being wrong when we don't end up following the worst-case high-emissions path, that's like blaming a mortgage calculator for being wrong because you decided not to buy the million-dollar mansion. The calculator wasn't wrong. It did its job perfectly. You just gave it a different set of inputs. You made a different choice.
Okay, so let's bring all this home. Let's talk about the real-world bottom line. Why does any of this actually matter for things like policy, the economy, and for you?
Let's start with a hard number just to ground ourselves in reality. The planet is warming at a rate of about 0.2 degrees Celsius per decade. That's not a model, that's not a projection, that's the observed fact that the models are successfully able to capture. And when we look to the future, you can see our choices laid out pretty clearly. Our future isn't set in stone. The amount of warming we end up with by 2100 depends almost entirely on which path we choose to go down. The models aren't telling us our fate. They are showing us the different consequences of different human choices.
And that's exactly why these models, even with all their imperfections, are such essential tools for managing risk. Governments use them to decide on policy. Engineers use their outputs to design bridges and flood defenses. Entire industries use them to figure out how to operate in a world where carbon has a cost. They don't need a perfect crystal ball. They just need a useful, scientifically grounded tool to plan for a range of possible futures. So really, we need to stop having the wrong debate. The question we should be asking isn't, are the models fake?
The real question, the productive question, is, okay, looking at the data, which future scenario are we tracking towards right now, and what's the smartest, most effective way to navigate the road ahead? It shifts the conversation from doubt to strategy. In the end, maybe the best way to think about it is this. Climate models are not crystal balls. They're instruments. And you wouldn't get in your car and rip the speedometer out of the dashboard because you found out it's off by 2 miles per hour, especially if that speedometer is telling you you're flying towards a sharp curve way too fast. They're imperfect, for sure, but they are absolutely essential tools for helping us see what's coming down the road.